Hello everybody. Today we're talking about cells. So before we get into the larger domains and kingdoms, we need to talk about what is the major dividing line between some of the major groups of organisms on Earth. And that comes down to the cell. So the first part of the cell is the idea that the cell is the building block of cell theory. Cell theory is the idea that all living organisms are made of basic units that we call cells. We have not seen any evidence of any other organisms that we categorize as alive. We did talk about what that means to be alive in a previous video. That there are no living creatures that do not have a cell. That said, we can now sort of divide all cells that we find on Earth, microscopic cells, we can divide them into two categories, the prokaryotic cell and the eukaryotic cell. The prokaryotic cell is one that has no nuclei, no nucleus, and no organelles. These are the cells that we find in bacteria and archaea, two of the broadest groups of organisms, or well, it's kind of narrowest, but two groups of the kingdom, or two groups of life that account for a wide range of organisms in the terms of how plentiful and uh, um, you know uh, present they are. So bacteria, of course, bacteria, not maybe not of course, but bacteria, if you don't know, cover every single surface you've ever touched, pretty much, with the exception of maybe a surface that's just been cleaned with an antibacterial agent, like a very strong alcohol. So in that, with that exception of a clean room, or a recently cleaned surface, bacteria are everywhere. I've heard say that if all living organisms on Earth, all eukaryotic organisms at least, were removed, there would be enough bacteria that we would still have our shape. That the shape of your body would still sort of be standing there for that brief second that you were poofed out of existence. So there's enough bacteria there. I forget the stat. I will have to look it up because I believe there's like a stat about how much bacteria is of your own body weight, and it's a fairly high amount. So it is the total mass we find is about 0.3% of your total body weight. Um, so okay, so that's not the not in a crazy amount. I guess that includes water maybe. So that's why the total bacteria mass we find represents 0.3% of the overall body weight, significantly updating the previous statements of 1 to 3%. So bacteria are, bacteria, you know, that's an interesting number. 0.3% of your own body weight. All right, let's see if we can, maybe I should have typed that. Okay, so the other type of cell is the eukaryotic cell, and these are the type of cells that we have and that all living animals have. So all animals, all plants, all funguses, all multicellular creatures are eukaryotic. So this is also uh, all. Come on, doesn't want to do it for me. Okay. So this is all multicellular organisms are eukaryotic, as well as some unicellular. So there are unicellular and multicellular eukaryotic cells out there. In our own bodies and in many multicellular organisms, we do find that cells are very different. They might have The eukaryotic cells might be specialized for certain functions. That's a very common thing to occur. Um, and so, but we're not going to get distracted with that idea right now. So here's two examples of these sorts of cells. So we have on the left the prokaryotic cell. Notice the lack of any internal structure on the inside here. So the internal structure here is very basic. We've got some DNA here, and then we have some ribosomes. We have some cell walls. So think about this as being a spherical object or a cylindrical object in this case. They don't have to have these sort of pili, which are little hairs on the outside that they use for grabbing and interacting with things. And then they also may have flagella, and that's about all they have. Over here in the animal cell, which is one example of a eukaryotic cell, we notice a lot of other things. And so what I'm going to expect is that you will learn all of these terms, specifically for a project that we're going to do. I don't typically test too much on the specifics here, but we do need to know them if we're going to use as we use them in the future units. So you do need to know your parts of your cell. You need to be able to kind of direct yourself, walk around a cell as we go. All right, so we're going to go through one by one each of the organelle pieces. For sure, feel free to check out any other videos on the web that have, a better animated versions of this sort of discussion, etc. So that could be, and I will definitely link some in our classroom. So plasma membranes, these are found in all cells, and they are boundaries that help control what enters and leaves. They are selectively permeable, which means that they will filter out many of the things that would be harmful to a cell. So they could filter out toxic chemicals, they can filter out different molecules, they can filter out harmful viruses and things like that. They are formed of a phospholipid bilayer, so that's what this is supposed to represent here. What we have here is we have something called a phosphate head and then a lipid bilayer. So this is the lipid here. And so that's why it's a phospholipid bilayer, because there are two of them. There's the phosphate head with the lipid legs, and then you take two of these. And so I'm just going to duplicate, and then you turn one upside down. Whoops. Duplicate. Let's see if I can do it. Turn it upside down, and then put it here, like that. And so that's what the bilayer part is. We have two of these phospholipids, and each one is upside down to the other to form a bilayer. And then you just sort of rinse and repeat, and you put them side by side. Now the phosphates like water, and the lipid does not. So that's one of the reasons that they organize in this way. It's a natural organization based on the attraction to water, which is kind of cool. It fits well with our story that we're going to make up later about how these things could have formed on their own in a universe that did not have cells at all. In fact, you'll notice this type of thing happens, a sort of cell actually can form from a phospholipid in your own home, and that cell is a bubble. So bubbles made of soap, those soap bubbles are forming because of a very similar feature. Soap has essentially a phospholipid type structure where it has a fat and a acidic or a basic end, and the basic end likes the water, and the fatty part doesn't like the water, likes itself. And so that's where bubbles form. So bubbles that we form in our soapy water are really just the same structure as very primitive cells. Now, transport proteins are these things that are found here. They sit inside the phospholipid bilayer, and they're there to allow for the transport of materials. So think about them as sort of it's very hard to draw in 3 dimensions on a piece of paper, but they are three-dimensional tubes, sort of the railroad system here. They would kind of be, like this. And so objects, I should say, chemicals can go in and out of the cell through this opening and enter the cell. So remember that this phospholipid bilayer is going to be very difficult to pass through. Only water really can pass through there very easily. So we can get a little water molecule here. So H2O can pass through, but not much else can. So water can pass through the phospholipid bilayer, but not really anything else. Everything else has to go through a protein. We also have cholesterol molecules. That's what's drawn out here. So these are the carbohydrates and cholesterol. We don't have a cholesterol drawn here, but those will help keep the membrane fluid. They break up this big web of phosphates. And then the carbohydrates and proteins, those can be used to identify the cell. So for an example, you may have heard of A, B, and O blood types. That is what's on here. So if you have an A hanging on the end of your blood cells, an A type carbohydrate, then that blood cell will be A type blood. If you instead put a B type carbohydrate, then that B will identify it as B type cells, etc. And then some cells even have A and B, and we call those the AB blood type. So that's where that comes from. So if you're ever interested in how come I have AB blood type, or why do I have A blood type but my parents have B blood type, all that's different is the carbohydrate on the outside of that cell. And that's why we call it an identifier. The cytoplasm is just the fluid, so in this case the blue stuff here, that's inside. That fluid is not water. I mean, it's water, it's mostly made of water, but it's actually a combination of chemicals. There's so many different types of chemicals floating around in that water that we can't call it water anymore. It's like saying that I drink a glass of brown water in the morning when I'm drinking my coffee. It's not water anymore, it's coffee. This is much more different than that. It's more different from water than milk or anything like that. So this is very different stuff, and so we call it cytoplasm. It's not water, although it's mostly made of water. It's water with a bunch of things dissolved in it. I'm going to say something like that here. Here, draw a text box. I'm going to say something like, although mostly water, the cytoplasm has many chemicals dissolved in it, making it very different from water. And those chemicals might range from biochemicals like enzymes, or even biochemical parts like, example, enzymes and proteins. We have, acids and bases, salts, fats, carbohydrates, organelles. All of these things are floating around inside the cytoplasm, which makes it very different from water. And in fact, if ever your cell breaks open, that's it. That cell's probably done. Because as soon as that cell membrane breaks, then the semi-fluid material on the inside, the cytoplasm, is going to leak out into this fluid that surrounds it, and that'll be the end of that cell. It needs that chemical to stay inside. Prokaryotic cells, they will do all of their chemical process in the cytoplasm. Eukaryotic cells have organelles, and each organelle can have inside of it its own fluid where its own biochemical reactions will happen. And then we also have sort of a cytoskeleton, which is scaffolding that holds the organelles in place.